The cruelest lie in that courtroom was not that Claire Whitman wanted Ethan Caldwell's money, but that Ethan had ever truly had any of his own. Margaret Caldwell said it with the polished sadness of a woman who had practiced grief in front of mirrors. "Your Honor, she married my son for money." The words landed softly, almost elegantly, but they cut through the courtroom like a blade wrapped in silk. A few heads turned toward Claire. Someone in the back row gave a low, knowing sigh, the kind people make when they believe they are witnessing a familiar story. The failed wife, the bitter divorce, the woman asking for more after the marriage had already ended. Claire did not move. She sat at the plaintiff's table in a navy dress that had cost less than Margaret's pearl earrings, her hands folded over a thin leather folder, her wedding ring long gone, but the pale market had left still visible when the light struck her finger just right. Across the aisle, Ethan Caldwell stared down at the table as if the grain of the wood had suddenly become fascinating. He was 41, handsome in the tired way men become when charm has been used as currency for too long. His dark suit was tailored, his watch expensive, his expression carefully wounded. Beside him sat his mother, Margaret, straight-backed and silver-haired, dressed in cream wool and old money certainty. His father, Robert, kept his jaw locked and his eyes fixed on the judge. Vanessa Monroe, Ethan's new fiancée, rested one manicured hand near his sleeve, close enough to signal loyalty, not close enough to share blame. Claire knew that choreography well. She had once been the woman seated beside Ethan, smiling when he squeezed her hand under tables, staying quiet when his family rewrote facts into something prettier. The courtroom smelled faintly of lemon cleaner, paper, and rain-soaked coats. Outside, Boston was buried under a gray February morning, the kind that turned the courthouse windows into dull mirrors. Inside, every sound seemed too loud. A pen clicking, a chair shifting, the soft scrape of Margaret's bracelet against the wooden rail as she continued. Claire came into our family with very little. We welcomed her. We gave her a life most people only dream of. And now, after everything, she wants to punish my son financially. Claire felt the old reflex rise in her chest, the urge to explain, to defend, to make them understand. It was a reflex Ethan had trained into her over 8 years of marriage. Explain why the bill was late. Explain why the bank called. Explain why his mother was upset. Explain why she had transferred money from her savings again. But her attorney, Daniel Brooks, had told her before they walked in, do not rescue them from their own statements. So Claire stayed silent. Judge Eleanor Hayes, a woman with sharp gray eyes and the calm patience of someone who had watched too many families turn love into paperwork, looked down at the file before her. She turned one page, then another. The room waited for her to chastise Claire, or perhaps to ask Ethan another sympathetic question. Instead, the judge stopped on a bank statement clipped with a yellow tab. Her eyes narrowed slightly. She looked up, first at Margaret, then at Ethan, then at Claire. "Mrs. Caldwell," she said, her voice even, "if Ms. Whitman married your son for money, perhaps you can explain why the record shows she paid his debts." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of every lie the Caldwell family had carried into that room, suddenly too heavy to hold. For one suspended second, no one seemed to understand what the judge had said. Margaret blinked as if the sentence had arrived in a language beneath her social class. Ethan's shoulders tightened. Vanessa's hand, which had been resting near his sleeve with such decorative loyalty, slowly drew back half an inch. It was a small movement, almost nothing, but Claire saw it. She had spent years learning how to notice tiny withdrawals of affection. Judge Hayes looked down at the statement again, then at the attorneys. "Mr. Caldwell, this payment from Ms. Whitman's individual account was made 3 years before the divorce filing. It went directly to the Internal Revenue Service under your Social Security number. Is that correct?" Ethan cleared his throat. "I would need to review the context, Your Honor." Context. Claire almost smiled. Ethan had always loved that word. Context was what he called a lie when it wore a better suit. The sound of paper sliding across Daniel Brooks's table carried Claire back to the first time she had seen the Caldwell house from the inside, 8 years earlier, on a bright September afternoon when Boston still felt warm and merciful. The family home sat in Chestnut Hill behind a stone wall and a black iron gate, all ivy, polished brass, and windows that reflected the sky, so perfectly they seemed designed to keep reality out. Ethan had squeezed her hand as they walked up the front steps. "Do not let them intimidate you," he had whispered, smiling as though intimidation were a charming family tradition, like sailing or underseason holiday dinners. Claire had been 30, a senior auditor at a regional accounting firm, living in a 600-square-foot condo in Somerville that she had bought with careful savings and the small inheritance her father had left her. She was not glamorous, not loud, not the kind of woman who entered a room expecting it to rearrange itself around her. But she was steady. She understood numbers. She understood patterns. And at the time, she believed she understood Ethan. He had seemed different when they met at a charity auction for a children's literacy nonprofit, standing awkwardly beside a watercolor he clearly did not like, but was bidding on anyway because the artist's mother was watching. He made Claire laugh within 5 minutes. Within 30, he had told her that most people in rooms like that were performing wealth instead of living meaningful lives. It had sounded wise then. Later, she would understand that he was not criticizing performance. He was studying it. Margaret had welcomed Claire with a kiss that touched the air near her cheek, but not her skin. Robert had asked about her work, then looked mildly disappointed when she answered in detail. At dinner, the silverware was heavy, the wine glasses thin as breath, and the questions wrapped in velvet. Where did her people summer? Had she always worked so much? Did she plan to keep her job after marriage? Or was that merely a phase of independence? Ethan laughed off each insult before Claire could decide whether it had happened. "They are just old-fashioned," he told her on the drive home. "They liked you." And because she loved him, because humans have built entire civilizations on hearing what they need instead of what was said, Claire believed him. 6 months after the wedding, the first envelope arrived. It was not dramatic. No red stamp, no threatening knock at the door, just a notice from the Internal Revenue Service folded into Ethan's leather briefcase between a country club receipt and a dinner menu. $38,000. Ethan found her holding it at the kitchen island, the marble cold under her palms. For the first time since she had known him, his confidence cracked. "It is temporary," he said. "A filing issue from before us. I was going to handle it." But he did not handle it. Claire did. She moved money from her personal savings, told herself marriage meant partnership, and believed the debt was an exception. She did not yet know exceptions were becoming the marriage. The first payment changed nothing on the surface, which was what made it so dangerous. The Caldwell house still glowed at night behind its iron gate. Margaret still hosted charity luncheons where women in soft cashmere discussed poverty over $12 sparkling water. Robert still spoke about legacy and discipline as though those words could balance a bank account. Ethan still kissed Claire on the forehead in front of his parents and called her his anchor, a word that sounded romantic until she understood he meant something heavy enough to keep him from drifting into consequence. After the Internal Revenue Service notice was paid, he promised it would never happen again. He brought her white roses, cooked dinner badly but sweetly, and stood barefoot in their kitchen in Brookline telling her he had been ashamed. Claire wanted to believe shame could become honesty. She wanted to believe marriage was not a ledger where one person kept depositing forgiveness while the other made withdrawals in the dark. For a few weeks, life settled into something that almost resembled peace. Then came the business loan, $72,000. Personally guaranteed, past due by 45 days. Ethan told her it was tied to a real estate venture with his father, a bridge investment, nothing more. "It is how families like mine operate," he said, as though debt became elegant when spoken in a calm voice. Claire sat across from him at their dining table, the loan documents spread between them, the chandelier reflecting in the polished wood like small trapped moons. "Why did you not tell me before it went past due?" she asked. Ethan rubbed his face with both hands. "Because I knew you would look at me exactly like this." That was another trick she would not recognize until years later. The way he turned her concern into cruelty, her questions into attacks, her competence into something cold. The next morning, Margaret called. Not Ethan. Margaret. Her voice arrived through the phone smooth and scented with accusation. "Claire, dear, Ethan is under tremendous pressure. Men who build things sometimes take risks. A wife can either become another burden or she can protect her husband while he finds his footing." Claire stood in the copy room at work, the hum of the printer behind her, fluorescent light flattening everything into exhaustion. She had a quarterly audit due by 5 o'clock. She had slept 4 hours. She had already begun calculating what she could move without touching retirement accounts. This is not just about Ethan, Margaret continued. It is about the family name. Public embarrassment helps no one. There it was, the Caldwell religion. Not truth. Not responsibility. Appearance. Claire paid enough to bring the loan current. Then she paid the late fees. Then she opened a spreadsheet, because numbers were the only place people could not smile and lie their way out of what they had done. She labeled the file household transfers, because calling it rescue would have felt too honest. Each line had a date, a recipient, an amount, and a reason. Internal Revenue Service payment, business loan cure, credit card settlement, property tax shortage. Ethan called her meticulous when he was grateful and obsessive when he was cornered. At first, he thanked her in private. Then he stopped thanking her at all. The debts became weather, inconvenient but expected. A storm rolled in, and Claire was expected to stand there with an umbrella large enough for everyone. By their second anniversary, she had learned the rhythm of the marriage. Ethan created urgency. Margaret created guilt. Robert created silence. Claire created solutions. She took consulting projects after work, reviewing small business books for owners who paid her by check and apologized for calling after dinner. She skipped vacations, delayed dental work, wore the same black heels until the lining split near the heel. At Caldwell dinners, Margaret complimented Vanessa Monroe, then only a junior associate in Ethan's office, for being so effortlessly polished. Claire smiled into her water glass and said nothing. She had begun to understand that in that family, sacrifice was invisible unless it came wrapped in diamonds. One rainy April night, Ethan came home smelling of expensive bourbon and panic. He stood in the doorway of their bedroom while Claire folded laundry, his tie loosened, his face pale. "I need to ask you something," he said. She looked at him and felt her body answer before her mind did. A small tightening in the ribs, the familiar warning bell. The amount this time was not $72,000. It was $186,000. A private note tied to Robert's failed development deal, carrying Ethan's signature and a deadline of 10 days. Claire sat down on the edge of the bed, a towel still warm from the dryer in her lap. "Ethan," she whispered, "what have you done?" He did not answer directly. He never did when the truth was ugly. He only said, "We can fix it." And by we he meant her. Claire sold the Somerville condo on a Wednesday morning in June, while the city outside the closing office shone with the careless brightness of a world that had no idea her life was being converted into a cashier's check. The condo had never been impressive by Caldwell standards. 600 square feet, 1 bedroom, old hardwood floors that creaked near the kitchen, a view of the neighbor's brick wall if she leaned at the right angle and pretended optimism was architecture. But it had been hers. Her father had helped her paint the living room the summer before he passed, both of them laughing when the pale gray dried 2 shades darker than the sample card. She had bought the small brass lamp by the window with her first bonus. She had learned how to be alone there without feeling lonely. Signing those papers felt less like selling property and more like surrendering the last room in the world where no one had ever called her selfish. Ethan could not attend the closing because of what he called investor meetings, though Claire later found a restaurant charge from that afternoon at a seafood place on Newberry Street, 2 entrees, 2 glasses of wine, and valet parking. Margaret sent a text with 3 words, "You did well." Not "thank you." Not "I am sorry." You did well. As though Claire were a trained employee who had performed the unpleasant but necessary task of protecting the Caldwell name from public weather. The check cleared 2 days later. $186,000 went directly toward the private note tied to Robert's failed development deal. Another $22,000 covered late penalties and legal fees. Claire kept the remaining balance in her personal account for exactly 9 days before Ethan needed part of it for a credit card settlement he described as legacy expenses. The phrase almost impressed her. Only Ethan could make overspending sound inherited. After that, their marriage changed texture. It did not explode. It thinned. Ethan became kinder in public and farther away in private. At Caldwell dinners, he placed his hand at the small of Claire's back when people were watching, then spent the drive home answering emails with his face lit blue by his phone. Margaret praised Claire's discipline at brunches, never naming the money, never naming the sacrifice, only saying things like, "Claire is wonderfully practical. Every family needs one practical person." Practical, Claire learned, was what wealthy people called a woman when they needed her labor but not her pride. She built her spreadsheet at night after Ethan fell asleep, the glow of her laptop turning the bedroom into a quiet confession booth. Household transfers became longer than some short stories. Every line was precise because precision was the only dignity she could afford. Date, amount, account, purpose, source documentation. She attached receipts, wire confirmations, bank notices, tax letters, screenshots of messages. She did not yet know she was building evidence. She thought she was building memory, a private record to remind herself she was not imagining the slow disappearance of her own life. By their third anniversary, Claire had paid more than most Americans owed on a starter home, and the Caldwell family had mastered the art of treating her like a guest overstaying in a house she was secretly keeping warm. Ethan began bringing Vanessa Monroe into conversations with the casualness of a man testing whether a room would burn. Vanessa was efficient, he said. Vanessa understood pressure. Vanessa had real presence with clients. The first time Claire met her, it was at a charity gala in Back Bay, beneath chandeliers that scattered gold light over rented smiles and silent rivalries. Vanessa wore a crimson dress and a diamond tennis bracelet Claire recognized from a charge Ethan had called a client gift. She was polite in the way beautiful, ambitious women are polite when they have already been told they are winning. "I have heard so much about you," Vanessa said, touching Claire's arm lightly. Claire looked at Ethan, waiting for discomfort, apology, anything human enough to hurt honestly. He only adjusted his cuff links and smiled at a donor across the room. That night, Claire understood something colder than betrayal. Ethan was not hiding Vanessa because he feared losing Claire. He was revealing Vanessa because he had stopped believing Claire would leave. After all, where would she go? Her condo was gone. Her savings were drained. Her name was tied to his emergencies like a rope tied to a sinking boat. A week later, Margaret invited Claire to lunch at a quiet hotel restaurant near Copley Square, where the salads cost $32 and the waiter spoke softly enough to make cruelty seem tasteful. Margaret stirred lemon into her iced tea and said, "Men like Ethan need admiration, dear, not accounting." Claire looked at the woman who had watched her sell a home, empty accounts, and rescue debts buried under generations of polished manners. "I thought marriage meant partnership," Claire said. Margaret smiled with pity sharp enough to draw blood without leaving a mark. "Partnership is a lovely word, but a wife must know when to be supportive and when to stop keeping score." Claire went home that afternoon and opened the spreadsheet. For the first time, she changed the file name. Not household transfers. Not rescue. She named it Caldwell Debts Paid by Claire Whitman. Then she backed it up in 3 places. The new file name sat on Claire's laptop like a line drawn across a life she had been too polite to defend. Caldwell Debts Paid by Claire Whitman. No metaphor. No soft language. No version of the truth dressed up to make Ethan comfortable. She stared at it for a long time that night, listening to the quiet rhythm of the dishwasher and the distant hum of traffic moving along Beacon Street. Ethan was still downstairs, supposedly taking a call from a client, though his voice had dropped into that warm, careful register he used when he wanted someone on the other end to feel chosen. Claire did not go downstairs. She opened the folder and began organizing everything with the calm precision that had once made her valuable to the very people who now treated her like a burden. The Internal Revenue Service notice went first, then the wire confirmation, then the private loan cure, then the proof of sale from the Somerville condo, signed in blue ink, scanned at high resolution, backed up to an external drive and a secure cloud account. Every document had a date. Every transfer had a source. Every emergency had a name, and every name was Ethan's. Over the next year, the marriage became a room where no one said the thing everyone could smell burning. Ethan stayed out later. Vanessa appeared more often in stories that did not require her. Margaret began inviting Claire to fewer family events, then acted wounded when Claire stopped asking why. Robert avoided her altogether, which was almost a kindness. At work, Claire moved through audits and client calls with the clean efficiency of a woman who had learned that exhaustion could be folded and carried if no one asked too many questions. Her colleagues thought she was composed. Her neighbors thought she was private. Ethan's family thought she was manageable. Only Claire knew how close she was to vanishing inside the role they had built for her. The divorce papers arrived on a Friday in October, delivered by a courier who apologized twice without knowing why. Claire was home early with a migraine, wearing old sweatpants and one of her father's Boston Red Sox sweatshirts, the one thing Ethan had never been able to make look inappropriate. She opened the envelope at the kitchen island where she had once found the first tax notice, and for a strange moment, the symmetry nearly made her laugh. Ethan did not come home that night. He called at 9:17, his voice controlled and faintly irritated, as if she had forced him into an inconvenience. Claire, I wanted to discuss this in person, but it is better for both of us to be mature. Mature. Another word humans use when they want the injured person to bleed quietly so the guilty person can keep dinner reservations. Is Vanessa the reason? Claire asked. The silence was brief, but it was enough. This is not about Vanessa, he said. This is about us. We have wanted different things for a long time. Claire looked around the kitchen, at the marble counters she had helped pay to refinance, at the brass fixtures chosen by Margaret, at the framed black and white photograph of Nantucket that Ethan had bought with a credit card Claire later settled. Different things. Yes, he had wanted admiration without accountability. His family had wanted rescue without gratitude. Claire had wanted a marriage. What do you want, Ethan? She asked. He exhaled as though relieved she had finally become practical again. A clean separation. No drama. No public ugliness. My attorney will be fair. His attorney was not fair. Fairness did not arrive in a letterhead stamped with Caldwell, Pierce & Rowe, a firm where Robert had played golf with two senior partners and Margaret sent holiday baskets large enough to feed small governments. The first proposal described Ethan as the primary financial provider and Claire as a spouse who had benefited from his lifestyle. It offered her almost nothing beyond the right to leave quietly. Worse, it implied that she had mismanaged household funds and contributed to Ethan's financial strain through excessive personal spending. Claire read that sentence 3 times. Then she read it again, slower, waiting for anger to come like fire. It did not. What came instead was something colder, steadier, and far more useful. She walked to the hall closet, took down the external drive, and plugged it into her laptop. The folder opened instantly. Caldwell debts paid by Claire Whitman. For the first time in years, Claire did not feel like a wife trying to save a family. She felt like a witness preparing to testify. Daniel Brooks worked out of a narrow office on the 7th floor of a brick building near Government Center, the kind of place with old radiators, framed law degrees, and windows that looked directly into another building's windows, as if even the architecture had given up on privacy. Claire found him through a former colleague who said, very carefully, "He is not flashy, but he reads everything." That was all Claire needed. Flash had been Ethan's language. She wanted someone fluent in paper. Daniel was in his late 40s, with tired eyes, a navy tie slightly loosened, and the calm impatience of a man who had seen too many decent people apologize for needing help. He did not interrupt while Claire spoke. He did not tilt his head with pity. He did not say divorce was hard in that soft, useless tone people use when they want to sound kind without becoming involved. He simply listened as she laid out the years in order: the tax debt, the business loan, the private note, the condo sale, the credit card settlements, the property tax shortage, the refinancing costs, the legal fees paid from her personal savings. When she placed the external drive on his desk, it made a small sound against the wood, barely more than a click. To Claire, it sounded like a lock opening. Daniel inserted it into his computer and began scanning the folders. His expression did not change much at first. Then he leaned closer. He opened the spreadsheet. He opened the bank statements. He opened the emails from Ethan, each one dressed in panic and affection. "I hate asking this. I swear this is the last time. You are the only person I trust. Please do not tell my mother until I fix it." He opened the text messages from Margaret, the ones Claire had saved without knowing why. Families survive because women understand discretion. Ethan is embarrassed enough. Do not make this harder. Keep this between us for now. Daniel sat back after nearly 20 minutes and removed his glasses. "Claire," he said, "this is not a divorce file. This is a financial autopsy." The words should have frightened her. Instead, they steadied something inside her. Autopsies, at least, told the truth about what killed a thing. Over the next several weeks, Daniel's office became the first room in years where Claire did not feel unreasonable. They built the case piece by piece, not with outrage, but with dates. Ethan's attorneys responded with polished denial. They claimed the payments were voluntary marital contributions. They claimed Claire had enjoyed the benefits of the Caldwell lifestyle. They claimed there was no written loan agreement requiring Ethan to repay her. Daniel expected that. People who depend on shame rarely prepare for documentation, he said, sliding another stack of exhibits into order. But the hardest part was not the legal argument. It was watching Ethan's version of their marriage take shape in official letters. In his filings, Claire became demanding, resentful, financially confused, eager to punish him for moving on. He described himself as generous. He described his family as supportive. He described Vanessa as irrelevant to the dissolution of the marriage, which was such a careful lie that Claire almost admired its posture. The first temporary hearing was brief and humiliating in the ordinary way courtrooms can be humiliating, with strangers reducing years of private ruin into numbered exhibits and scheduled conferences. Ethan arrived with Margaret and Robert as if the proceeding were a family board meeting. Vanessa did not attend that day, though Claire noticed Ethan checking his phone beneath the table. Margaret wore charcoal wool and an expression of injured dignity. When she passed Claire in the hallway outside the courtroom, she paused just long enough to speak without looking directly at her. "I hope you understand what this is doing to Ethan." Claire looked at the woman who had taught her that silence was loyalty when it protected a man and weakness when it protected herself. "I understand exactly what protecting Ethan costs," Claire said. Margaret's mouth tightened, but she walked away. That evening, Claire returned to the small apartment she had rented in Cambridge after leaving the Brookline house. It was on the third floor, with uneven floors, radiator heat, and a kitchen window that looked over a narrow alley where someone had placed 2 stubborn pots of winter herbs. It was not elegant. It was not impressive. But every bill was in her name. Every key was hers, and no one in that apartment needed rescuing except the woman learning how to sleep through the night again. By the time the final hearing was scheduled, Boston had moved from winter into a reluctant spring, the kind that arrived in mud at the curb, pale sunlight on courthouse steps, and daffodils trembling like they had survived something personal. Claire walked into the Suffolk County Courthouse that morning with Daniel Brooks beside her and a folder pressed against her ribs. She wore the same navy dress from the first hearing, not because she lacked another, but because it reminded her of something useful. She had survived the last time they tried to make her feel small. She could survive it again. The hallway outside courtroom 4 was already crowded when she arrived. Ethan stood near the windows with his hands in his pockets, speaking quietly to his attorney, a silver-haired man named Preston Hale, who looked as though he had been assembled from expensive dental work and strategic disappointment. Margaret and Robert sat on a wooden bench beneath a framed notice about mediation services, both dressed as if the law itself had invited them to brunch. Vanessa was there too, in a pale beige coat with gold buttons, her engagement ring catching the fluorescent light each time she adjusted her purse. She saw Claire first. Her eyes moved over the navy dress, the modest heels, the simple leather folder, and landed on Claire's face with a softness that was almost pity. It was the expression of a woman who believed she was entering the final chapter of someone else's embarrassment. Margaret rose when Claire approached, not fully, just enough to perform civility for witnesses. "Claire," she said, her voice cool and careful. "There is still time to end this with dignity." Claire stopped a few feet away. For years, Margaret had made dignity sound like silence. She had wrapped surrender in good manners and called it grace. "I brought documentation," Claire said. "That is dignity enough for today." Something flickered across Margaret's face, irritation first, then a small flash of fear so quick it might have been missed by anyone who had not spent 8 years studying her. Ethan heard the exchange and turned. For a moment, Claire saw him without the courtroom mask. Not the injured husband, not the misunderstood son, just a man who had borrowed too much from everyone, including reality, and was beginning to suspect the bill had arrived. "Claire," he said, stepping toward her. Daniel moved slightly, not blocking him, just existing with legal inconvenience. Ethan lowered his voice. "This has gone too far. We can still settle." Claire remembered another Ethan, standing barefoot in their kitchen with roses in his hand, promising that the tax debt was the last emergency. She remembered him at the dining table, telling her she looked cold when she asked for bank records. She remembered the night he said a clean separation would be better for both of them, as if he had not already cleaned out everything she had built before him. "You had many chances to settle honestly," she said. "You chose a story instead." His jaw tightened. You do not understand what this will do to my family. There it was again, the sacred Caldwell family, always somehow endangered by the truth and never by the conduct that made the truth necessary. Before Claire could answer, the courtroom doors opened and the clerk called their case. The sound moved through the hallway. Like a bell. Everyone stood. Margaret smoothed her coat. Robert cleared his throat. Vanessa touched Ethan's arm, but this time he did not seem to feel it. Inside, courtroom 4 was smaller than Claire remembered, or maybe she had grown larger since the first time she entered it. The walls were beige, the benches polished by decades of anxious hands, the flag standing quietly in the corner. Judge Eleanor Hayes took the bench at 9:30 exactly, reading glasses low on her nose, her expression unreadable. Claire sat beside Daniel and placed her folder on the table. Across the aisle, Preston Hale began with charm polished thin enough to see the steel underneath. He described Ethan as overwhelmed, the Caldwell family as generous, and Claire as a former spouse attempting to transform normal marital support into a personal claim. Margaret nodded faintly at the phrase normal marital support. Vanessa looked at Claire again, almost kindly, as if kindness were another accessory. Then Preston said it. He did not use Margaret's exact words. He was too careful for that. But the meaning entered the room dressed in legal language. He suggested Claire had pursued reimbursement only after realizing Ethan would not reconcile, that she had enjoyed the benefits of his family's social standing, and that her financial claim reflected resentment more than fact. Claire felt the courtroom tilt toward the old story. The bitter ex-wife. The ambitious outsider. The woman who wanted more. Daniel did not object immediately. He let the words hang there, ugly and useful. Then he stood, buttoned his jacket, and carried one thick exhibit binder to the podium. Your Honor, he said, we welcome the opportunity to discuss facts. Claire looked down at her hands. They were steady. That surprised her most of all. Daniel's voice did not rise, which somehow made every word harder to ignore. He placed the exhibit binder on the podium and opened it with the quiet care of a man setting a clock before a storm. Your Honor, opposing counsel has characterized these payments as ordinary marital support. We disagree. The evidence shows a pattern of personal funds from Ms. Whitman being used to satisfy debts held by Mr. Caldwell individually, debts incurred before or outside the ordinary household, debts that were then omitted or minimized during settlement discussions. Preston Hale shifted in his chair, already preparing to object, but Judge Hayes lifted one hand without looking at him. Proceed. Daniel turned the first page. Exhibit 12. Notice from the Internal Revenue Service dated March 14th, addressed to Ethan Caldwell individually. Amount due, $38,412. He paused just long enough for the number to settle into the room. Exhibit 13. Wire confirmation from Claire Whitman's individual checking account, funded from premarital savings, since 6 days later. Claire kept her eyes on the judge, not on Ethan. She knew if she looked at him, she might be pulled back into the old habit of measuring his discomfort before her own truth. Judge Hayes leaned forward slightly. Mr. Hale, was this tax liability disclosed as a marital obligation in your client's initial financial statement? Preston stood. Your Honor, we would need to clarify whether the parties treated that matter as shared during the marriage. Judge Hayes looked over the rim of her glasses. That was not my question. A faint rustle moved through the benches behind them. Margaret's chin lifted in offense, as though accuracy had behaved rudely. Daniel continued. Exhibit 14. Email from Mr. Caldwell to Ms. Whitman, sent the same week. He read only the necessary line, his tone flat enough to keep it from becoming theater. Ethan had written that he was ashamed, that he would repay her, that she was the only one who could keep this from becoming a disaster. Claire remembered receiving that email at 11:42 at night, sitting on the bathroom floor, because it was the only room where Ethan would not see her cry. Back then, the sentence had felt intimate, almost tender. Now, read aloud beneath courthouse lights, it sounded like what it had always been, a request disguised as love. Daniel turned another page. Exhibit 21. Business Loan Delinquency Notice. $72,000 past due, guaranteed by Mr. Caldwell. Exhibit 22. Payment confirmation from Ms. Whitman's personal investment account. Exhibit 23. Text message from Margaret Caldwell to Ms. Whitman. Margaret's face changed before the words were read. It was not dramatic. Her mouth tightened by a fraction, her left hand closing around the handle of her purse. Claire had seen that expression at dinner parties when a guest mentioned something inconvenient, like a lawsuit, a failed fundraiser, or a relative in rehab. Daniel read the message slowly. Families survive because women understand discretion. The courtroom went very still. Even Vanessa looked down. Judge Hayes wrote something on her legal pad. The scratch of her pen sounded enormous. Preston stood again, smoother this time. Your Honor, private family communications can be interpreted many ways. They often can, Judge Hayes said. That is why context matters. Continue, Mr. Brooks. Daniel did. He did not rush. He did not embellish. He laid each document down like a stone across a river Claire had been trying to cross for years. The private note tied to Robert's development deal. The $186,000 transferred after Claire sold her Somerville condo. The closing statement showing the property had been purchased before the marriage. The cashier's check issued 2 days later. The credit card settlement paid from the remaining proceeds. The property tax shortage covered from Claire's consulting income. Each exhibit made the Caldwell version of reality smaller, thinner, less able to breathe. Ethan's face lost color in stages. Robert stared straight ahead, his jaw working once, then going still. Margaret no longer looked offended. She looked busy calculating what could still be denied. Then Judge Hayes stopped Daniel at a spreadsheet projected onto the courtroom monitor. It was Claire's spreadsheet, cleaned and formatted by Daniel's office, but still unmistakably hers. Dates, amounts, recipients, sources, purposes. Years of marriage reduced to columns because columns, unlike people, do not flatter cowards. The judge studied it for a long moment. Mr. Caldwell, she said, turning toward Ethan, is it your testimony that these payments were gifts? Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time that morning, his charm had no door to enter through. For several seconds, Ethan did not answer. The question sat in front of him like a glass of water he could not swallow. Were the payments gifts? Claire watched his face search for a version of the truth that would not cost him anything. She knew that face better than any courtroom ever could. It was the expression he wore when a waiter brought the wrong wine, and he wanted to seem gracious while making someone else feel small. It was the expression he wore when bank statements arrived, and he needed Claire to become understanding before she became angry. Preston Hale stood quickly, saving his client from the silence. Your Honor, my client is not prepared to characterize every transaction without reviewing the full marital context. Judge Hayes looked at him for one long moment. Mr. Hale, your client had months to review these exhibits. Preston sat down with the faint stiffness of a man and used to being corrected in public. Daniel Brooks turned another page in the binder. Your Honor, the characterization matters because Mr. Caldwell's filings repeatedly describe Ms. Whitman as financially dependent on him. The records show the opposite. We are not discussing occasional groceries, shared utilities, or ordinary household purchases. We are discussing individual liabilities, delinquent obligations, and debts that directly preserved Mr. Caldwell's credit, business reputation, and family standing. He lifted a printed email from the exhibit stack. May I approach? The clerk took the page to the bench. Judge Hayes read silently. Claire did not need to see it. She knew every word. Ethan had written it after the private note tied to Robert's development deal came due. I know this is unfair. I know I have asked too much. But if this goes public, my father will never recover, and neither will I. I will make it right, Claire. I promise. Back then, Claire had read that message at 2 in the morning in the glow of their bedroom lamp, while Ethan slept beside her as if confession had exhausted him more than consequence. She had believed the promise because the alternative was admitting she had become a bank with a pulse. Judge Hayes placed the email down. Mr. Caldwell, she said, did you write this? Ethan's voice came out lower than before. Yes, Your Honor. Did you repay Ms. Whitman? He glanced at Preston, then at his mother. Margaret stared straight ahead, her pearl earrings motionless against her neck. Not formally, Ethan said. Daniel's eyebrows lifted slightly. Not formally. He repeated, not as mockery, but as a door opening. Your Honor, Exhibit 37 is a text exchange from 2 months later. He read the exchange aloud. Claire had asked Ethan when he intended to begin repaying the funds from the condo sale. Ethan had replied, once Q3 closes, I will start transferring monthly. You saved us. I know that. I will not forget. A sound came from the gallery, soft and quickly swallowed. Vanessa had gone very still. The pale beige coat, the gold buttons, the glittering ring, all of it suddenly looked less like victory and more like costume jewelry under bad lighting. Claire wondered, not unkindly, what Ethan had told her. Perhaps that Claire was unstable. Perhaps that she had lived off him and then demanded more. Perhaps that his first marriage had been a sad mistake with an ungrateful woman who did not understand ambition. People rarely fall in love with villains. They fall in love with narrators. Daniel moved to the next set of documents. Exhibit 41. Message from Margaret Caldwell to Ms. Whitman after the condo sale. He paused. The message reads, "You did well." Margaret's face flushed faintly. Daniel did not look at her. Exhibit 42. A second message from Mrs. Caldwell 1 week later. Please do not discuss the note with anyone outside the family. Robert is under enough strain. Judge Hayes turned toward Margaret. Mrs. Caldwell, you were aware Ms. Whitman sold premarital property to satisfy a debt connected to your husband's failed development deal? Margaret's lips parted. For once, elegance failed to arrive on command. I was aware she assisted the family during a difficult period. That was not my question either, Judge Hayes said. Claire felt something loosen inside her chest, not joy, not triumph, but the strange relief of hearing someone else refuse the fog. Daniel then presented the final sequence. The credit card settlement, the property tax payment, the legal invoice from a lender's attorney, each paid from Claire's personal account or consulting income. The courtroom monitor displayed a timeline stretching across 5 years. Blue lines marked Claire's transfers. Red lines marked Ethan's obligations. The pattern was so obvious it seemed almost embarrassing that anyone had tried to deny it. Ethan's debts appeared. Claire's money followed. The Caldwell family remained polished. Claire became poorer. Daniel let the timeline stay on the screen while the silence gathered weight. Then he said, Your Honor, the total amount documented so far is $428,619. Claire heard the number as if from underwater. She had known it, built it, checked it, lived it. But spoken aloud in that room, it became something else. Not sacrifice. Not loyalty. Evidence. Judge Hayes looked across the aisle. Mr. Caldwell, she said, before this court hears another word about Ms. Whitman's alleged financial motives, I suggest you consider the record very carefully. Ethan lowered his eyes. Margaret did not move. Robert's hand covered his mouth. Vanessa finally pulled her chair an inch away from Ethan, and the sound of wood against tile was small, sharp, and unforgettable. The number remained on the courtroom monitor long after Daniel stopped speaking, as if the room itself needed time to accept it. $428,619. It was not a dramatic number in Caldwell terms, not compared to the houses they toured, the charity pledges they announced, the watches Robert collected and forgot in drawers, but it was the number that had hollowed out Claire's savings, sold her condo, postponed her future, and taught her how expensive loyalty became when given to people who mistook it for weakness. Judge Hayes let the silence stretch until even Preston Hale seemed unwilling to disturb it. Then she removed her glasses and looked directly at Ethan. Mr. Caldwell, you have filed statements suggesting Ms. Whitman benefited financially from this marriage. The court has now reviewed multiple exhibits showing substantial transfers from her individual assets to satisfy your individual and family-related obligations. Do you dispute the authenticity of these documents? Ethan swallowed. Claire saw the movement in his throat, small and human, and for one fragile second she remembered loving him. Not this pale man trapped beneath evidence, but the man who once stood beside a badly painted charity watercolor and made her laugh. That memory did not soften her. It only saddened her, because even the sweetest beginning can become an alibi if you let it. No, Your Honor, Ethan said. I do not dispute that the documents are real. Margaret turned toward him so sharply her pearl earrings swung against her jaw. Robert closed his eyes. Vanessa stared at the tabletop with an expression Claire could not read, though for the first time, it did not contain pity. Preston rose, attempting to gather the collapsing story with both hands. Your Honor, while the documents may be authentic, the legal interpretation is still at issue. Marriages involve mutual support. Financial decisions are often made without the expectation of repayment. Judge Hayes nodded once. That is true. It is also true that courts are capable of distinguishing between ordinary marital support and a pattern of one spouse using separate premarital assets to satisfy obligations later omitted, denied, or reframed by the other spouse. Preston sat down. Human beings are fascinating when they discover that vocabulary is not armor. Daniel then called Claire briefly, not to perform pain, but to establish facts. She stood, took the oath, and sat in the witness chair with the folder resting in her lap. The wood beneath her hands felt smooth and cool. Daniel's questions were simple. Did she own the Somerville condo before marriage? Yes. Did she sell it during the marriage? Yes. Where did the proceeds go? To debts owed by Ethan and connected to the Caldwell family. Did Ethan promise repayment? Yes. Did she receive repayment? No. He showed her the email, the text, messages, the wire transfers. Each answer was a nail placed gently, precisely, into the coffin of their lie. Then Preston cross-examined her. He tried charm first, then confusion, then implication. Ms. Whitman, is it fair to say you enjoyed the Caldwell lifestyle? Claire looked at him. I enjoyed my husband when I believed he was honest. A murmur moved through the room before the judge quieted it with a glance. Preston's smile tightened. You lived in a beautiful home, attended private events, traveled with the family. I also paid overdue taxes, business loans, credit card settlements, property shortages, and legal bills that were not mine. But no one forced you to do that, correct? There it was, the question every selfish person eventually asks of the person who saved them. Claire folded her hands. No one forced me. Ethan asked. His mother pressured. His father stayed silent. I believed I was protecting my marriage. Preston leaned slightly forward. And now you want compensation because that marriage failed. Claire looked past him for a moment, toward Ethan. He could not meet her eyes. No, she said quietly. I want the court to stop pretending I was taking from a family I was holding together. Judge Hayes wrote something down. Margaret's face had gone pale beneath her careful makeup. Robert looked suddenly older, smaller, less like a patriarch than a man who had allowed a daughter-in-law to pay for his pride. Vanessa's chair remained 1 inch away from Ethan's. That inch had become a country. When Claire returned to counsel table, Daniel did not smile. He only slid a glass of water toward her. It was the smallest gesture, and somehow the kindest. Across the aisle, Ethan finally looked at her, not with anger, not with love, but with the stunned expression of a man seeing the person he had used as scenery step out of the background and become the only figure the room could see. Judge Hayes called a brief recess before issuing her ruling, and the room exhaled as if everyone had been underwater. The clerk's announcement sent people shifting to their feet, but no one moved quickly. The Caldwell family had entered that courtroom wrapped in certainty. And certainty, Claire discovered, made a poor coat once the weather changed. Margaret remained seated for several seconds, her purse clutched against her lap, eyes fixed on a point above the judge's empty chair. Robert leaned toward Ethan and whispered something Claire could not hear. Ethan shook his head once, not in denial exactly, but in the exhausted rhythm of a man who had finally run out of places to put blame. Vanessa stood first. She smoothed the front of her beige coat, lifted her purse from the floor, and looked at Ethan with an expression that was almost formal. I need some air, she said. It was not cruel. That made it worse. Cruelty would have given him something to argue with. Her calm gave him nothing. She walked out through the double doors without waiting for his answer, her heels clicking softly across the tile, each step measuring the distance between the man she had believed and the man the documents had revealed. Claire watched her go and felt no satisfaction. Vanessa had not stolen a prize. She had inherited a story Ethan had edited for resale. Daniel touched the edge of Claire's folder. You did well, he said quietly. For a moment, Claire nearly laughed at the phrase. Those same 3 words from Margaret had once made her feel like hired help in her own marriage. From Daniel, they meant something different. They meant she had survived telling the truth without apologizing for it. In the hallway, the courthouse smelled of damp wool, coffee, and old stone warmed by weak spring light. Claire stood near a window overlooking Pemberton Square, watching people hurry along the sidewalk with briefcases and paper cups, all of them carrying private disasters under ordinary coats. Ethan approached her alone. Without Margaret. Without Robert. Without Vanessa. That absence was almost louder than his footsteps. Claire, he said. She turned, but Daniel stayed nearby, close enough to remind both of them that charm had lost jurisdiction. Ethan looked older in the hallway than he had at council table. The fluorescent lights flattened the expensive lines of his suit. For the first time, Claire noticed a tiny loose thread near his cuff. Once she would have reached out and fixed it without thinking. Once she had mistaken maintenance for love. "I never meant for it to become this," he said. It was the closest he had come to an apology, and still, somehow, he stood outside the center of the sentence. It had become this, as though the marriage had wandered into ruin by itself, unattended by choice. Claire looked at him, and what surprised her was the absence of heat. No trembling anger. No desperate need to make him understand. She had spent years wanting him to see what he had done. Now the court had seen it, and that was enough. "You let your family call me a liar," she said. "You let them call me greedy. You sat there while they used my silence as proof." Ethan closed his eyes briefly. "My mother was trying to protect me. So was I," Claire said. The words were simple, but they landed between them with the weight of every transfer, every late night, every sold piece of her former life. Ethan opened his mouth, then stopped. There was nothing useful left to say. Behind him, Margaret appeared at the end of the hallway, watching them with the rigid composure of a woman trying to turn humiliation into posture. She did not come closer. Perhaps she understood, finally, that some rooms could no longer be entered through entitlement. The clerk called everyone back inside after 20 minutes. Courtroom settled into silence as Judge Hayes returned to the bench. She had removed the yellow tabs from several pages and stacked the exhibits neatly before her. "This court is not here to punish disappointment," she began. "It is not here to assign moral worth to the end of a marriage. But it is here to examine evidence, and the evidence in this matter is unusually clear." Claire felt her pulse in her wrists, steady and deep. Judge Hayes continued, her voice level, each sentence clean enough to leave no hiding place. "Ms. Whitman used separate premarital assets and individual earnings to satisfy substantial debts held by Mr. Caldwell and connected to the Caldwell family. These payments were documented, acknowledged in writing, and, in several instances, accompanied by assurances of repayment. The court does not accept the characterization that these were ordinary marital expenses." Preston Hale stared down at his legal pad. Ethan sat motionless. Margaret's face had gone still in the way porcelain goes still before it cracks. Then Judge Hayes looked directly across the aisle and said, "A woman is not financially opportunistic because she asked for the return of funds she used to rescue someone else from consequence. She is a creditor, and in this case, she is a creditor with records." The words moved through Claire slowly, not like victory, but like oxygen returning to a room that had been sealed for years. Judge Hayes ordered Ethan Caldwell to reimburse Claire Whitman for the documented separate funds used to satisfy his debts, including the proceeds from the Somerville condo, the Internal Revenue Service payment, the business loan cure, the private note tied to Robert's development deal, the credit card settlement, the property tax shortage, and the related legal fees Daniel had proven with the patience of a man building a bridge out of receipts. The amount would be entered as a structured judgment with interest, and Ethan would be responsible for a significant portion of Claire's attorney's fees because, as the judge stated, the record showed repeated attempts to minimize, mischaracterize, and delay disclosure. Claire listened without moving. For years, money had been treated as something shameful whenever she asked about it, and something noble whenever the Caldwells needed it. Now, in the plain language of the court, every hidden transfer had been returned to its proper name. Not generosity, not marital support, not a wife doing what wives were expected to do. Debt, obligation, record. Judge Hayes closed the file with a soft, final sound. "This matter is resolved as to reimbursement," she said. "Counsel will submit the final proposed order within 10 business days." The gavel did not strike like thunder. It was quieter than Claire expected, almost ordinary, and that made it more powerful. Real endings rarely announce themselves with music. They arrive in paperwork, signatures, and the sudden knowledge that a room you feared has no power left to hold you. Ethan remained seated. After everyone else began to rise, Margaret stood slowly, her face composed but colorless, one hand pressed against the back of the chair as if balance had become a private negotiation. Robert would not look at Claire. Vanessa was already gone, and the empty chair beside Ethan seemed to accuse him more honestly than any person could have. Preston Hale gathered his papers with the brisk embarrassment of a man packing away a performance that had failed. Daniel turned to Claire and nodded once. He did not offer a speech. He understood, perhaps better than most, that some victories are too heavy for applause. Outside the courtroom, the hallway looked exactly the same as before: beige walls, dull tile, strangers waiting for their own lives to be reduced to case numbers. But Claire felt different moving through it. Not lighter, exactly. Lighter was too simple. She felt returned, like a box mislabeled for years had finally been opened and placed in the correct room. Near the elevators, Margaret called her name. Claire stopped, not because she owed the woman anything, but because she no longer feared what might be said. Margaret approached alone, each step careful, her pearls bright against her throat. "I hope you are satisfied," she said. The old Claire would have heard accusation and tried to soften it. The woman standing in that courthouse hallway heard only a confession too proud to kneel. "No," Claire said calmly. "Satisfied is not the word." Margaret's mouth tightened. "Then what is?" Claire looked past her to the tall windows where spring light fell across the stone floor in pale gold squares. She thought of the Somerville condo, her father's laughter, the gray paint that dried wrong, the years spent mistaking endurance for devotion. She thought of all the women taught to keep quiet so families can keep their reputations clean. "Free," Claire said. She left Margaret standing there and walked into the elevator beside Daniel. On the ground floor, reporters from a local legal blog waited near the entrance, having caught enough of the public docket to know a prominent family had lost something more delicate than money. One of them stepped forward and asked whether Claire wanted to make a statement. Daniel glanced at her, ready to shield her if needed. Claire looked at the courthouse doors, at the city beyond them, at Boston moving on in coffee cups, taxi horns, and people crossing streets against the light, because humanity is apparently allergic to patience. Then she said, "No, let the documents speak. They were ignored long enough." She stepped outside into the cool afternoon. The air smelled of rain, pavement, and the first stubborn green things pushing through winter's leftovers. Her apartment in Cambridge was small. Her savings would take time to rebuild. The judgment would not return the years or the condo or the woman she had been before Ethan Caldwell learned how useful love could be. But it gave back the truth, and truth, Claire had learned, was the first asset no one should ever let another person steal. That evening, she placed the external drive in a small fireproof box, not because she intended to live in the past, but because proof had earned its rest. Then she opened her kitchen window, made tea, and sat alone at the little table overlooking the alley herbs. For the first time in years, no one needed saving. And for the first time in years, Claire did not confuse peace with emptiness. The first week after the ruling was strangely quiet, and quiet, Claire discovered, could feel suspicious when a person had spent years living inside other people's emergencies. She woke each morning before her alarm, expecting some new message from Ethan, some carefully worded request from Margaret, some formal letter designed to make truth expensive again. But the inbox stayed still. The phone did not glow with crisis. The Cambridge apartment remained exactly as she had left it each night. A mug in the sink, a cardigan over the chair, the little pot of rosemary on the windowsill leaning toward the pale spring sun, as if even herbs understood survival better than most families. On Friday afternoon, Daniel Brooks called to say Preston Hale had submitted the proposed order without objection. "They are not happy," Daniel said, his voice dry. But unhappiness is not a legal argument, despite the best efforts of wealthy people. Everywhere. Claire smiled for the first time that day. The first payment arrived 3 weeks later, not enough to rebuild everything, but enough to make her bank account look less like a crime scene. She sat at her kitchen table and stared at the deposit until the numbers blurred. For years earlier, that money would have gone immediately towards someone else's problem. Ethan's tax issue, Robert's failed deal, Margaret's demand for discretion. Now there was no emergency attached to it. No man waiting in another room, ashamed only until rescued. No mother-in-law turning gratitude into expectation. Claire transferred a portion into savings, paid Daniel's final invoice, and scheduled a consultation with a financial planner named Marcy Levine, who wore bright red glasses and said, after reviewing Claire's documents, "Your first goal is not wealth. It is never again becoming someone else's backup plan." Claire liked her immediately. Rebuilding did not look cinematic. It looked like spreadsheets, automatic transfers, a used bookshelf from a neighbor moving to Worcester, and learning which grocery store marked down flowers on Sunday evenings. It looked like walking past a real estate office in Harvard Square and not flinching at the photos of condos taped in the window. It looked like calling her mother's old friend in Somerville and asking whether the woman who bought her former condo still lived there. She did. She had repainted the living room sage green. Claire thought that would hurt more than it did. Instead, she felt a soft, surprising tenderness for the place, as if it belonged to a younger version of herself who had done the best she could with the warnings she had not yet learned to read. Ethan sent one email in late May. No greeting. No apology large enough to deserve the word. Just 3 paragraphs about regret, pressure, family expectations, and how everything had become distorted. Claire read it once while standing beside the open window, the city warm and restless below. He wrote that he hoped someday she would remember the good parts. She did remember them. That was the problem with betrayal. It did not erase the beautiful moments. It made them evidence of how carefully the wrong person could borrow your trust. She did not reply, not because she wanted to punish him, but because silence, for the first time, belonged to her. In June, Claire accepted a senior finance role at a nonprofit housing organization in Boston, reviewing budgets for affordable developments across Massachusetts. The irony was not lost on her. After years of keeping a family estate polished from the shadows, she was now helping build homes for people who needed stability more than status. On her first day, she wore navy again, but this time it did not feel like armor. It felt like a choice. Her office was small, with a view of a parking lot and a stubborn maple tree, and her name was printed on the door in plain black letters. Claire Whitman, Director of Financial Compliance. She stood there longer than necessary, looking at it. Not Mrs. Caldwell. Not Ethan's wife. Not the woman who had been called greedy for asking to be repaid. Just her name, doing the simple, holy work of belonging to herself. That evening, she walked home across the Longfellow Bridge as the Charles River caught the last gold of sunset. Boston moved around her in its usual impatient rhythm. Runners, students, honking cars, cyclists behaving as if traffic laws were merely decorative suggestions invented by bored city planners. Claire laughed under her breath, and the sound startled her. It was not bitter. It was not careful. It was hers. When she reached her apartment, she opened the fireproof box and placed one new document beside the external drive, the final court order, signed and stamped. Then she closed the lid. Some stories do not end when the guilty are exposed. They end when the person who was harmed stops arranging her life around the harm. Claire made tea, turned off her phone, and sat by the window while the rosemary shifted in the evening air. For once, nothing needed to be proven. The records had spoken. The court had listened. And Claire, at last, had begun living in a future that did not require anyone else's permission.